My name is Amy Maxmen, and I'm a freelance journalist. Before I became a journalist, I was a scientist. I got a PhD from Harvard in evolutionary biology. Specifically, I studied sea spiders. Towards the end of my graduate career, I had a paper on sea spiders that was covered by some journalists, and I was enamored with the way that they could waltz into my life, learn about sea spiders for 2 days, and then leave, and then learn something else. So I changed my career from being a scientist to being a journalist. And although the two things are very different, there is quite a bit of overlap in the process. I went to Sierra Leone at the peak of the Ebola outbreak in December of 2014. I had wanted to learn about how research is conducted in the midst of an outbreak. So as I was reporting, I went to a hospital, a very large hospital in the west of the country, where they were doing some research. When I got there, I met an ambulance driver who told me how there had been strikes there for the months prior because a lot of the frontline workers, including him, hadn't been paid. At that point, a little bit later in the day, I sat down and I talked with a nurse. And she sort of stopped me mid-conversation after we had been talking for a while and said, "Journalists always want to hear about our stories, but they don't usually want to hear that we haven't been paid the money that we've been promised." So I left that day, and this really stuck with me. And I started wondering the same question. Why hadn't these frontline workers been paid? And also there was headlines full of how much money had been donated. So where were all the big donations going? And so also kind of like in science, sometimes they're just a question that drives you, so much so that you might put what you were working on to the side. So I was aware that this was going to be a hard article to write. It would require a lot of investigating. These weren't easy answers. So how do you locate the truth? How do you locate a difficult answer? And I think, again, like science, there's actually a lot of similarities there. In this situation, I needed something bulletproof. I couldn't just speak with one source or two sources, write down what they told me and have a story. I had to collect evidence in a way that was systematic. Not only did I collect stories from various nurses, I looked at logbooks of how often they were there, what the dates were they were there. I looked at registries of Ebola patients. I talked to NGOs, to the UN, all of these things pointing towards the fact that yes, these people had been working. But I tried to put the data that was easy to tabulate into files. So as part of the story, I could also then address what happens when I take this Excel file and I present it to the people in charge of pay. As far as the second part of the story goes, there were various websites that supposedly said where donations went. None of those things added up. So what I tried doing was seeing where they met, where they conflicted, and why. I had imagined I could have a pie chart. This is where every dollar was spent. I was not close to being able to do that, but still I was able to come to some sort of conclusion, which was that humanitarian aid could be a lot more transparent. And I could also say where the big donations had not gone. Specifically, 98% of them had not gone to frontline workers in the health system. The evidence that I needed for an investigation, the Excel files, recorded interviews, that's all essential so that I have a bulletproof story. However, it doesn't mean that anybody's going to read it, and that's sort of where the journalism comes in. And if you think about sort of what's going to interest your best friend when you're catching up over dinner, it's not going to be you rattling off statistics. People are interested in people and their stories. And the way that I approach that journalistically, sort of in the field when I'm reporting a story, is to just spend time with people. If they're, in addition to collecting logbooks, one of the nurses who I enjoy speaking with, I might ask her, is it okay if I come over tomorrow? Do you have time tomorrow? And maybe I'll want to get her out of her element or go into her element away from work so that we could talk a little bit more and I can hear just about why she became a nurse and what her mother did for a living and if she has children, what are her struggles, what is she happy about? And it's those sort of stories, those are the kind of things that you can put into your writing. I would say the difference between a journalistic piece and a scientific manuscript is that you're trying in journalism to attract a person that may not care very much about the subject that you're writing about. And what you're hoping to do is elicit some sort of response from them. So if you can think about it, for example, you'll have a scientific manuscript that might say something like 350 health workers died during the Ebola outbreak treating Ebola patients. Meanwhile, a journalistic piece might tell you about a nurse who has a name, who has woken up at 5 a.m. every morning to come to the Ebola unit. And when she arrives on Tuesday morning, she walks in and she finds 4 patients who are lying in the latrine, covered in their own feces and vomit. There's a person who's dead on the floor, and now she has to clean them off and carry them to their beds. In the first one, it's a number, and if a person's not specifically interested in Ebola, they might stop reading. The second one elicits a response in a person, so they might be interested in reading more only because now they felt a human feeling. And you're hoping in journalism to reach that person who otherwise wouldn't be reading. So scientific manuscripts serve a very important purpose. They're written for other researchers who need to learn something very efficiently. In journalism, you're hoping to reach beyond that audience. So why should the global health community care about journalism? Well, if you care about public health, then you want people to make good decisions. And we know what happens when the public or when politicians make bad decisions. So rather than moaning about people or talking about how crappy the media is, I think a more constructive use of everyone's time is to think about how to write stories that are enticing, that are accurate, and that are honest.